All right, I think we are live, so we should be ready to go. Yes, we are live. All right, let me get the clinical studies that we're going to be discussing, and then everything should be good from there. All right, let's just wait for people to come in. We're a little bit early, so let's see, give ourselves about 2 minutes to get started on things. Okay, people are starting to come in. Let's just give it about a minute or so, and then we'll go ahead and we'll get started. All right, so let's go and let's get started. So I have a couple of clinical study designs that I would like for us to go through, as I think they're extremely important for us to understand how clinical studies in this space work. So let's go step by step, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so FDA, peptide. All right. So let's do the screen share, and then we should be able to get all that started. Okay. Okay. All right. So sorry for this. Sorry for the delay. Okay. So let's see. It's taking a little bit longer to upload, but it'll get there. Essentially, what I want to do is I want to go over the clinical study design for retatrutide, which is they're calling it the third generation GLP-1, although it's really been around for quite some time and it's not technically a GLP-1 medication. There's different mechanisms of action that are available with this. So let's go step by step with this uh, medication, and then we can figure out where to go from there. So let's see. Clinical study design, and then do share screen and clinical study designs. Okay. All right. So you guys should be able to see, and those of you who are in attendance, if you cannot see this, just please let me know. Okay. All right. So study of retatrutide. So what is retatrutide? Retatrutide is a medication that has all the capabilities of a GLP-1 and GIP, but also has additional blockers as well. So they call it a triple receptor. So the three receptors that it goes through are GLP-1, like semaglutide, GIP, like tirzepatide, but then it also has a glucagon receptor agonist. So what does that do? Well, basically, the GLP lowers the average blood sugar. The GIP with increment helps to attenuate the GLP receptors as well. Now, with the glucagon, what happens is that it helps to increase the relative concentration of insulin, which helps to further lower the blood sugar levels, thereby enhancing the weight loss. It effectively combines three hormones into one molecule, offering potential superior weight loss. And now the key thing is 24.2% in phase two trials, so 24% more weight loss. So that sounds pretty exciting. So let's go through this. All right. So first, it had 169 locations. So pretty nice distribution. This right here tells you that they had a pretty expansive array of sites that they did a study on. So from that plant standpoint, it's not like it's one clinical study. So I think the more sites they are, the more diverse the patient population, the better it is. Now let's look at the inclusion criteria because this is critical because who they include in the study is reflective of how well the study will affect you. Now, the inclusion criteria has a mandate where there is at least one cardiovascular condition. Now, this is critical because a lot of patients who are taking the GLP-1 medications would not have some cardiac conditions. A lot of them would be relatively healthy patients that are looking to lose weight. So that's the issue at hand here. A history of a heart attack, myocardial infarction, but not within 90 days, has taken a history of self-reported unsuccessful effort to lose weight, but have not tried other medications. So you're dealing with a patient population that has heart conditions, but haven't really tried other weight loss medications. And in that sense, you're not really dealing with majority of the GLP-1 patient populations, right? You're not dealing with those that are looking at comparing various GLP-1 plans. So the thing is, this right away is not a typical patient population that you would assume would be interested in the GLP-1 medications. So now let's go through the actual study design itself. How is the study designed? right? So they'll receive the retatrutide injections, right? Just like you would with the semaglutide or tirzepatide. And then the comparison is the placebo. So this is the conclusion that they ended up coming up with. So let me make sure that you guys got this, okay? So Lilly's triple agonist retatrutide delivers weight loss of up to 71.2 pounds along with substantial relief from osteoarthritis pain in the first successful phase 3 trial. When did they talk about osteoarthritis as an inclusion or exclusion criteria? It was about the cardiac conditions. So this is where you start to get the issues of the misinformation and the speculative claims that are made in a lot of the mass media outlets with the GLP-1 medications causing certain side effects and whatnot. There's no mentioning or specifications of osteoarthritis in the clinical study design. It's an incidental finding. So it's not necessary that retatrutide helps with osteoarthritis. It's just in the clinical study design, it was incidental. So here's what they looked at. Positive top line results, phase 3 trial. Now, are they referring at any point to the patients that were screened for cardiovascular conditions? No. At any point were they dealing with anything related to, so here you see cardiometabolic health. But in here they're talking about obesity and knee osteoarthritis. So what they're showing here is that there was significant weight loss over the placebo, which is in accordance with the study design. So now they're talking about the cardiovascular risk here, an additional secondary endpoint. But what's interesting is that in the study design itself, they focused on patients with cardiovascular conditions. So the point of this is to say a few things. One, the clinical study designs do not necessarily reflect what is touted as an outcome for the clinical studies. So you guys should be very careful when you look at these clinical study designs to see if the design itself, how subjects were classified in the clinical study, actually correspond with what the endpoints are purported to be in the clinical study. Notice how nothing in the inclusion or exclusion criteria talked about osteoarthritis, but it was mentioned as one of the endpoints in the clinical study. That is what we would call in the clinical literature an incidental finding. Yet Eli Lilly touted that as one of the major outcomes. Again, speculative at best, not what the clinical study design was. So clearly it was incidental in nature. Now, if they did a second study where they focused on patients with osteoarthritis and said, this is how we're selecting patients, and then this is the outcome that they came up with, then that would be a different story. But clearly in this case, their focus was on cardiometabolic health, on patients with a history of myocardial infarction and other heart-related conditions, and that's how they screened the patients. There's no mentioning of osteoarthritis, no mentioning of arthritis in general, but the finding that there was benefit with patients of arthritis could at best be determined to be speculative because that is not what the study design is screened for. So as you start to look at different peptides, look at the clinical studies behind the peptides, because the key thing is to see how were the patients, rather the subjects, screened for in the clinical study design, and what are they claiming to be the benefits of the outcome related to that clinical study design. If the two don't match up, it could be what's known as an incidental finding and not necessarily germane to the actual medication itself. All right. I think we have some questions or anything at this point. Let's see. Um, no? Okay. So, what I want to do at this time is go to another clinical study. All right. So, we talked about the retatrutide. We talked about how the clinical study focused on cardiometabolic health, yet the outcome was for including osteoarthritis for whatever reason. So that leads us to believe that there were speculative findings that are claimed to be outcomes for clinical study, but not truly an outcome itself. Hey, Christina, how are you doing? All right. So now let's keep going. All right. So we talked about the retatrutide. Yes, the retatrutide is more beneficial, right? GLP-1, GIP, glucagon, a lot more benefits than what you'd see otherwise. Now let's talk about another medication that am frequent to prescribe to patients who are not responding well to GLP-1 medications. And this medication is called sermorelin. So with the sermorelin, what you get is a growth hormone analog. It's not a growth hormone, it's a growth hormone analog. It's a peptide that mimics what the body naturally produces with the growth hormone to help build muscle mass. So oftentimes there'll be patients who will have whether that's weight loss stagnation or they feel like they're losing weight and losing muscle at the same time. This medication really helps to alleviate those concerns. So this study focuses on sermorelin with adult onset growth hormone insufficiency. So to be clear, this study does not reflect how I prescribe sermorelin in conjunction with semaglutide. So let's talk a little bit about how I prescribe those two together. Sermorelin, I prescribe either on a nightly basis or either 2 or 3 times a week at night or immediately after a person engages in exercise. The semaglutide I would prescribe on a weekly basis. So the idea behind this would be, can we have sermorelin and semaglutide together to help with the weight loss and the muscle enhancement? And how does this clinical study help with that? I saw a question, when would retatrutide be available? I have it available on a selective basis. And we can talk a little bit about when we can have that available. But I think for now, let's talk a little bit about the clinical studies themselves so that we can move forward and learn a little bit about how to debunk a lot of false claims that are made in the clinical studies. And just to reiterate, the retatrutide clinical study that I had discussed that was financed by Eli Lilly talked about patients with cardiometabolic health, a history of myocardial infarctions, a history with heart attacks rather, and the clinical outcome talked about osteoarthritis. So we have to make sure that the clinical study design corresponds with the outcomes that they talk about, because every day you see people say, oh, well, this peptide does that, this peptide does this, but does the actual clinical study support that? And I want to talk a little bit about sermorelin and how I prescribe that with semaglutide and how the clinical studies support that indirectly. So let's go through this. So growth hormone replacement therapy, a lot of times patients with that adult onset, they'll take high doses of sermorelin, but at a low dose, the sermorelin can help with maintaining muscle mass while the patients are losing weight with the semaglutide. So in this instance, what they're referring to is how the medication was used for children, but then it was eventually used for adults. So the key thing here is that there is no direct correlation with what the dosing schedule should be for children relative to adults. But what they're assuming is a speculative correlation between, hey, adults are bigger, they have more body mass, they probably need a higher dose of the medications. In the same vein, when I prescribe the protocol of, let's say, 10 units or of 20 units of the sermorelin, it's speculatively assuming that the patient does not have a growth hormone deficiency, but rather they would benefit from a boost in the growth hormone to help complement the weight loss that they're achieving with the GLP-1 medications. All right, there's a couple of questions. Okay, let's see. Okay, these are direct questions. Okay. So I'd mentioned that I do have the retatrutide available on a selective basis for patients. The sermorelin with the semaglutide is also available for certain patients. I believe I have like quite a few patients that I've co-prescribed the semaglutide with the sermorelin. Again, the sermorelin is preloaded to be around 10 to 20 units, dosed on a 10 to 10 milligram per milliliter scale, so pretty normal dose, given at a quantity that's relatively low, but intended to overcome any sort of weight loss stagnation that may come from muscle loss. So again, how I came up with the dosing criteria was in effect estimating. Just like in this clinical study, they estimated what the dosing criteria would be for adults relative to children. So in the same vein, I'm adjusting what the dosing criteria would be for adults who do not have growth hormone deficiency, as opposed to in this clinical study, those with growth hormone deficiency. Any questions or anything at this time? All right. Now I want to talk about a medication that is becoming quite popular these days. It's called NAD, and it's often used to help with energy by helping to support mitochondrial metabolism. So let's go over how the clinical study designs of NAD lead to the decisions we make to prescribe and at what dose, because you see a lot of uh, marketing oriented materials online where they talk about, hey, take the NAD, take the injections, but they don't really talk about how to prepare, and they don't really talk about how to dose it as well. So I think it's important that we talk a little bit about the dosing schedule for NAD. The patients that I've prescribed NAD with the actually, I have more patients on NAD and tirzepatide than I do with NAD and semaglutide. And I think the reason for that is the tirzepatide accelerates the weight loss at a faster rate than the semaglutide. As a result, you start to see energy depletions as well because the body is undergoing an excessive metabolic load to lose the weight. The NAD helps to overcome that metabolic load by providing additional energy. So let's talk a little bit about the NAD dosing schedule itself. All right. So, dietary supplementation with NAD boosting in humans, current knowledge and future directions. All right. So, they talk a lot about the clinical usage of this. All right. Now, what these findings show is that there's promising preclinical findings indicate that increasing NAD plus is linked to improvements in physiologic function and select biomarkers of health span, meaning you live a healthier life longer, health span compared to lifespan. So now the question is, can this apply on a one-to-one basis for individual patients? And that's the key thing here. So the question then becomes, how do we show the individual benefits of NAD for specific situations? So this is a model that shows the NAD and the precursor, the nicotinamide riboside, and the NMN, which is another biomarker related, the nicotinamide mononucleotide related to the nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. These are all just fancy names for the molecular pathway of NAD and how it affects different aspects of the human body. Now, a lot of times you'll see people touting, oh, NAD is this miracle drug. It has X, Y, and Z, and there's clinical studies to back it up, so on and so forth. But let's get a little bit more into the detail of those things, okay? This chart here goes through individual clinical studies and talks about what the benefit was. So in this 2017 study, and I will make this article available in the descriptions, and also I'll tag it on different social media links, so you don't have to worry about where I got this study from. Healthy young men and women were given this level of dosage. It was orally, and clinical outcome was it was safe. So what this study essentially showed was that there was no risk factor in patients. So if you look at all these clinical studies, the primary outcome, now the later ones tend to get a little bit more in detail, but these top studies, the primary outcome was treatment was safe. Now this is critical because a lot of times there will be studies on medications like NAD, sermorelin, semaglutide, and the outcome will be that the treatment was safe. And then they'll tout all these benefits. Well, NAD did this, NAD did that. Well, those findings tend to be more incidental in nature, meaning they were not statistically proven in the clinical study, but they were incidentally found among subjects in the clinical trial. Now, that's a critical distinction that you have to understand, that when we talk about the benefits of these medications, a lot of times the clinical studies behind those medications don't necessarily design the study for those outcomes, but rather find those outcomes to be speculative secondary and tertiary benefits of the clinical study design itself. All right, I can continue, but are there any other questions or anything? We're getting to the bottom of the or the top of the hour, so I can keep going through this clinical study, but I just want to get feedback from people in attendance to see if this is the direction we want to go, or if there's any other questions we have before we discuss the NAD a little bit further. All right, so now let's get to the benefits of the NAD itself. So in this study here, what they found was that after exercise, there was a benefit in the NAD in what they call whole body substrate utilization and skeletal mitochondrial function. So basically, it's just a fancy way of saying the metabolism was more efficient after taking NAD. But interestingly, after a longer duration, the effects went away. So what does that show? It shows that NAD has time sensitive benefits on the overall body metabolism that when taken orally long term, the benefits tend to go away. So how does that inform the treatment decisions that I make when I prescribe patients NAD? Well, the first thing is that I realize that it's a short acting medication that, when taken orally, has a lower effect. So I prescribe the medications in an injectable form so that you inject the medications subcutaneously and that you'll inject it at various frequent intervals. So the most I will go is every 3 days. Typically, I request that patients take it every other day so that there is a sufficient amount of the NAD into the body so that the metabolism that you'll see in long term effects start to go away. Okay, so now let's conclude with this statement over here, and then we can wrap it up and leave it open for any questions or anything before we end the time. All right. So again, when you look at these studies that really focus on the performative value, they all have the primary outcome of whether the medication was safe. So all these other benefits and findings are not primary outcomes of the clinical study design themselves, but are found to be secondary outcomes themselves. And the reason for that is a lot of times it's easier to conduct a clinical study. You need smaller sample size, fewer subjects for studies that are just focused on the medication being safe. But interestingly enough, there was select improvement in cardiovascular, liver, and physical function. Again, improved body composition, physical function, muscle function, reduced markers of liver inflammation. All of this corresponds to what is the intended mechanism of action with the NAD, which, going to the earlier part of the study, talk about the benefits in mitochondrial metabolism, talk about energy, talk about improving the vasculature. And yes, all these effects are secondary to that. If you're improving your overall metabolism, you're going to lose weight. It's not that weight loss is a primary effect, but it is a secondary effect of the medications. So let's wrap this all up, because the key thing is this medication going to help me? And if it helps me, how is it going to help me? The NAD helps in short duration when injected into the body instead of ingested orally. And the primary effects come from the primary benefits of the mitochondria on the body. Now, with that being said, how does this translate to other effects like weight loss, improved energy, what have you? If you are engaged in the lifestyle with diet and exercise, taking GLP-1 medications to help optimize those lifestyle changes, the NAD will help improve the mitochondrial activity in relation to the diet and exercise and the GLP-1 medications. That means you'll see more energy with the weight loss. You'll see more metabolic activity contributing to the weight loss. But all of these are second order effects of the primary focus of improving mitochondrial activity. And that's why the results are not consistent, because you have to optimize your lifestyle for mitochondrial activity. That means you need the diet and exercise. So, absent the diet and exercise, the effects of the NAD won't be as pronounced. All right. I think I've talked enough. I've spoken enough. Any questions or anything for you guys that I can help answer at this time? I think I put everybody to sleep. All right, guys. Thank you so much for your time. We will continue this every week. Any questions or anything, you guys know how to get a hold of me. I will make all the clinical studies that I discussed in this webinar available. This is live on YouTube and it should be live on Facebook in a few moments. All right. Thank you so much for your time, guys. Appreciate it.